Welcome back to another video. In this video, we are going to be having a look at GitHub Desktop. So GitHub Desktop is a software you can install on your computer and use it instead of having to learn the Git command line. It's a good way to start learning about Git when you're not familiar with the command line. So it's a nice, easy to use graphical user interface. Now just to step back for a couple of minutes so we understand the Git environment and the relationships between the different components or services you can call them. First, we have Git version control software hosted on your local computer that is managing your Git repositories. And I have been managing my Git repositories through the Git bash CLI. So I've been using the CLI in my previous videos. I've already created some repositories in my previous videos. Then we have our GitHub cloud-based service that hosts many repositories from anyone who wants to share their repositories, whether that's with their team, privately, or publicly with anyone across the world. By the way, I've also done a dedicated video on GitHub. Now, although GitHub has its own management GUI via a browser, it has its own dashboard and you can do things in there. As we've already seen in the previous video, we can also manage GitHub repositories via the Git bash CLI as well. So my CLI, I manage my Git repositories. We can manage the repositories on GitHub as well to some extent. So we can push, pull and clone repositories amongst other things from GitHub using the Git bash CLI. However, instead of using the CLI in this video, we're going to be installing and using GitHub Desktop. And with Git Desktop, we are not only going to be creating new repositories, but we will also take a look at adding already existing repositories that I had created in my previous video when I created them using the CLI. So we'll take a look at how GitHub Desktop interacts with new and existing repositories. And we will take a look at repositories hosted on the cloud-based hosting service GitHub and how GitHub Desktop manages those repositories as well. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is install the application. I can either install GitHub Desktop from my dashboard. I'm signed into my GitHub account, or we can look for it on Google. And the options are we can download for Windows 64-bit or later, and there is also a macOS app for it as well, so we can download the macOS app from here. But I'm going to download it for Windows 64-bit, and now it's downloaded, we can open up the file. Once we have the app open, we can sign into our GitHub account from here, or if you don't have an account, we can create one from here. Create your free account. But I have one, so let's sign in. So over here it's asking us to select a browser to open up the sign-in page with. So I'm going to do that now and click on continue. And it's telling me over here, GitHub Desktop wants to access my account. And now I need to authorize my GitHub Desktop to access my GitHub account. Now it's asking me to configure Git, and it's auto-populated my name and email address. This is used to identify the commits you create. Anyone will be able to see this information if you publish commits. So any commit I make to my repositories, the name and email address is associated to it. You can customize this, however, per repository. So this is global, but you can customize it for each individual repository. Of course, if you wasn't happy with this information, you can configure it manually from here. Now it's installed GitHub Desktop, and what we can see is we can create a tutorial repository, and the tutorial repository will introduce the basics of working with Git and GitHub, including installing a text editor, making a commit, creating a branch, and pushing all of this to GitHub and opening a pull request. So it's ideal for learning how to use the GitHub Desktop. And we can see when I clicked on it, it says this will create a repository on your local machine and push it to your account. This repository will be visible to you and not visible publicly. So we've got that option. Then we've got the option to clone a repository from the internet. So if you know a repository you want to clone, you can select this option. And it gives you the option to use github.com. So you can clone from github.com. You can clone from GitHub Enterprise, or you can use a specific URL. So those are the options available as well. And then we have got create a new repository on your local hard drive. And so we can create a new repository. In fact, we can do this now. You want to give it a precise description what your repository is about. And we can specify the local path. I've already got an area where I'm storing my future repositories. So just need to look for it and create a folder to create my new repository in there. There it is. This one here. My Git project. So I want to create a new repository And if we look at this, if you have watched my GitHub video, here is where we create the README file. This is for more details about your project and any instructions you would like to associate with it. Then we have the .gitignore file, where we specify any files we want Git to ignore. So files part of the project we want Git to ignore. We can specify in here. And then the license. So I'm going to specify the MIT license, because it's a very permissive license that allows for nearly unrestricted freedom. It's the most popular license, everyone uses it, and users can use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, and sell copies of the software using this license. And then we can create the repository. So now we have created our new repository, and near the top we can see our repository. So the current repository we're in, and we can see our repository name. This is the current repository we are in, and we can see the current branch we are in, which is main. If we had more branches, we would see them in here. And we can also publish the repository to GitHub. So that would clone the repository and push it into the cloud into my GitHub account. And on the left, we have two tabs. One's the Changes tab and the other one is the History tab. In the Changes tab, this is where we see changes about our repository, what has changed, etc. And below this is the Commit box, where we commit our changes. So we specify a summary. We can choose to specify a description as well, and then we can commit to the main branch. And the History tab will show us all of our history. Currently, it only shows our initial commit where we created our new repository. We can see 3 changed files here, plus icon indicates a new file. We will also see a yellow icon with a dot inside it, and that indicates changes to an existing file. And we will have a look at that shortly. This is actually the .git attributes file, which is a configuration file in the Git repository. It's used for defining paths and files in a Git repository. It's basically there to define how Git should treat certain files. For example, line endings, merge strategies, and file encoding. If we go back to the Changes tab, in the middle we can see it's telling us this repository is currently only available on your local machine. And by publishing it on GitHub, you can share it and collaborate with others. So it's telling us to publish our repository, and we can view our files. So we can have a look at them in Explorer. So it's opened it up and we can see those 3 files. Git attributes file, the license file, and the README file. The ones we just seen in the History tab over here. So this is my new repository, and we can see where the physical files are kept within this folder here. Another repository for GitHub Desktop. We could create more files in here. Let's create a text file and just put something basic in it, like test my file. Let's close the file. And now if we go back to Git, it has detected my new file. So it's very instant. And now it's asking me to commit to main. Before this was grayed out, but now it's in blue. Let's make a change to the file as well. Let's save that. Let's go back to Git. And we can see instantly Git has detected another change. So we can now commit the change. Of course, you want to make sure you specify some clear, concise messages, a commit message and a description, and then commit to main. So we have committed to main. And if we go to the History tab, we can see our new commit. So this was my commit message, and it shows me my name, and the commit was just done now, where the initial commit was done 17 minutes ago. Now if we go back to changes, and actually if we go to my GitHub account, I can see my first project in here. This is my repository I created with my GitHub account. So I created this previously in the GitHub video on this page using the new repository button from here, or you can do it from here as well. But the point is we only have my one repository. If I go back to my GitHub desktop, we publish our local repository. So we'll keep the same name and we'll keep the same description, and we will keep this code as private, and we can see it's doing something in the background. So now if we go back to my cloud-based service, GitHub, and have a look at my dashboard, I now see my repository. I can go into this repository and I can see my files in here. So I can see my test file I created, and I can double click it and see my 2 changes in here. So that's how you create a new repository, and that's how you publish it to GitHub. Now going back to GitHub Desktop, at the top we've got some more options. So we've got File, and in File we've got New Repository, so we can create a new repository from here. But we can also add a local repository. So if we've already created a repository, for example, we used Git Bash, the Git Bash CLI, to create a repository, as I have done in previous videos, and then we later introduced GitHub Desktop. This is the way we bring that local repository into GitHub Desktop. And we can do this now. So if I click it, we have add local repository. So if I find my very first local repository I created, I think it was this one here, my Git, select folder, add repository, and there we go. I have just added my Git repository into GitHub Desktop, and we can see the current branch is main, but I can also see I have another branch in here. So we created another branch in one of my previous videos called my_branch2. So we can switch to the branch if we wanted to, and we can also publish my repository to GitHub as well. Another thing we can do in here, if we go to file, as well as adding these repositories, we've got options. So we've got quite a few options in here. So we've got accounts, this is for my accounts, integrations, and I can add Visual Studio from here as well, or any other text editor. And we can specify the command prompt, PowerShell, Git Bash, Windows Terminal. So in here, I can integrate Visual Studio Code or another external editor. I would just have to specify the path to it as well. And then we can specify our shell. My preferred choice is Git Bash. Then we've got Git. Now this is where we can specify our name and email address, which is associated with every commit we do. So these are global settings. This is associated with every commit, but we can change this for a specific repository. For example, so someone else is managing another repository and making commits. We can do that from the repository section in here. And then there's appearance. You can change the theme, notifications. You can enable notifications. We've got prompts, so confirmation dialogues, prompts, warnings about branches and commit length. So this is a good one. If I have changes and I switch branches, so what happens with the changes? Ask me where I want the changes to go. Always bring my changes to my new branch. Always stash and leave my changes on the current branch. So we saw this a few minutes ago when I cancelled, but you can change the options in here and some advanced settings and accessibility settings. Let's click on save to save changes. We've also got edit, which has the usual cut, copy and paste and find. Then we've got view, view changes, history, repository list. Let's have a look at that one. Repository list, it will show us our repository list. So another repository for GitHub desktop demo, and then my Git. And it shows us in blue there are uncommitted changes in this repository, and we can add repositories from here as well. Branch list, so we can see our list of branches, and we have some other options like zoom in and out, etc. And this is all about the repository, so we can push the repository. And then we've got other repository specific actions like pull, fetch, remove, open in Git Bash, show the repository in Explorer, open in external editor. So this is where we went into file options. We could integrate an external editor, and we also have repository settings. So here's the ignored files, the .git ignore file. Here's the git config settings, and this is where I can use a local git config. So I can configure someone else's name and email address associated to this specific repository. So if they were pushing and committing changes to this repository, I could use their details in here. I'm not sure if we have clone a repository, so we can clone a repository from GitHub, github.com, and I've got my first project in there, so let's click on this one and then click clone. And now it has cloned my first project. If you have a look at the history, we can see the history information. So I created all of this in GitHub. It's pulled it all down, and it's pulled down the history information as well. So you can see we created that repository 15 days ago, and then I updated the .git ignore file, and I also created myfile5.txt. We've also got the fetch origin option. So if there are changes made to the remote repository, you can pull them by clicking the fetch origin button, and if new changes are detected, we click pull origin to merge them into your local copy. So we can click this and it will have a look for us to see if there's anything there. Or we can go to GitHub. I'll go to my first project. I can make a change to my file 5 in here. New change, commit changes. Commit directly to the main branch. And now if I go back to GitHub desktop, I can do another fetch origin. So we can now see it's done that 1 minute ago. Update myfile5.txt. And we can see the specific change inside the file, new change. And the final two tabs is branch and help. With help, we can get some help. We can have a look at some logs in Explorer. We can have a look at our keyboard shortcuts, but we can also do many things with branches inside here. So branches allow you to work on different features or bug fixes separately from the main code base. So you would create a new branch if you was working on a feature or a bug fix. And the way we would create one is by selecting new branch. And then we can give our branch a name. Let's call it feature1_branch. And then we create the branch. So now if I go to the branch option here, I can see both branches, main and feature1 branch. And the way to switch branches is just by selecting them. So I've selected the main branch, it's going to switch me back into the main branch. If I go back to feature1 branch, if I go to repository, show in Explorer, go to my file 5, let's make a change. Let's call it feature1 branch, change to add a new feature, Ctrl S to save it. And then go back to my GitHub desktop. We can see it's detected the change. Now I want to merge this change back into the main branch. So how I would do that is I would go back into the main branch and I could either leave it as it is, leave my change on feature1 branch, or I could merge it back into my main branch. Bring my changes to main and then switch branch. And then we can commit our changes. Now it says you have one local commit waiting to be pushed to GitHub, push origin. And it says it over here as well, push origin. So of course we can do that as well. And that's it for this video. That's a high level overview of GitHub Desktop. So that's how we create new repositories in GitHub Desktop. And that's how we add already created existing repositories into GitHub Desktop. And we also had a look at how to push and pull changes to GitHub in the cloud. And finally, we had a look at branches, how we create new branches, make changes, and then merge them back into the main branch.